In searching for who will be amongst the biggest winners of the 2024 NFL Draft, you don't have to go too far beyond pick one. With the Commanders' pick at second overall, them being set to draft a franchise quarterback in a Jaden Daniels or a Drake May, Terry McLaurin will be one of the biggest winners of this draft. You're talking about a guy that is outside of wide receiver 3 territory in Dynasty, outside of the top 36. I foresee that reasonably, realistically, significantly improving where he stand a year from now even. I know he's 29 years old. It's going to be his age 29-year-old season, which is kind of crazy thinking that, man, time has flown. Just a function of, well, speaking of the draft, how old you are when you're picked. With Terry McLaurin, I see a guy that is set to have a season reminiscent of Nico Collins with a rookie quarterback this past season. Now, is it fair to assume what CJ Stroud just did is going to be what a Jane Daniels or a Drake May puts on the field? No, not necessarily. But do the Commanders have a player to the degree of Tank Dell's talent as another receiver in that room? To the degree of a Dalton Schultz's talent in that tight end room? I'm not really seeing it. And I don't fully expect it necessarily from the draft. With Terry McLaurin, I see his 2022 form rounding back into 2024. Effectively a top 15 receiver, a high-end wide receiver too. And I just see that holding itself for the next dynasty cycle, the next 2 to 3 years. Much better than wide receiver 39. I look at Cliff Kingsbury. His success with at least creating fantasy relevant players, receivers in and around, well, the same age at the time, with what Terry McLaurin stands now going into his age 29-year-old season. You look at, well, a certain DeAndre Hopkins, who had a top 5 season. Now, the talent, of course, doesn't rise to that of a D-Hop. And I'm not expecting a top 5 season. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is a season of fantasy relevance that is going to be much more than where he stands in the current Dynasty landscape. We're playing a game in Dynasty that is all projection. The scenarios that I go through back and forth in my head, I just see so many positives in the direction of a Terry McLaurin and what his fantasy future will be. Going down the draft board a little bit, staying in the top 10, that is the theme of this video, we're sticking with the Arizona Cardinals at pick 4. Kyler Murray recovered from the ACL, and I see recovery, a blank slate, a full recovery now, a year plus removed. I see Kyler Murray with a wide receiver 1, whether it's directly at pick 4 or with Monty Ossenfort, that Arizona front office, they showed an ability to move back and forth, jostle for whatever territory they want, whatever they deem as their guy at the top of the draft. A wide receiver 1, whether it's 4 or 8 or 6 or something, or somewhere in between. The Arizona Cardinals picking up a Marv, Malik, Rome spells incredible for Kyler Murray's fantasy future. Kyler Murray being a mid-late second-round pick, where we can stand a year from now, I fall back on him being, at worst, an early second-round pick. Very well being a top 12, a first-round caliber startup pick. I'm betting on Kyler Murray with a full, clean bill of health, a new receiver, arguably his best receiver that he's maybe had in his career, if you think D-Hop was in his prime or not in Arizona. You're talking about a guy with a tight end 1 everybody loves, and Trey McBride, who's a clear talent. Will address offensive line in some way in the draft. Upstart situation, Kyler Murray and that Arizona offense in general, I see big things. I see Kyler Murray very well possible of having a top 5 season, reminiscent of what we saw early in his career. So then you're looking at easily, firmly, a guy that you have to consider with a first-round startup pick a year from now, projecting it out. The talent that's there and how it's not going to go anywhere. Diverting a little bit from the quarterback train, we're talking about running back here. And for me, it's Breece Hall. I see him, look, he's already amongst the top 1, 2, 3 at the position in a dynasty sense. But I look at what the Jets are going to do at 10th overall, and in some way, they're going to support Aaron Rodgers. Whether that's a receiving weapon, how does that affect Breece Hall? Well, it's another meaningful body in that offense that the defense needs to account for. Maybe that ends up being 1 or 2 gaping holes, per drive that allows another big play for a Breece Hall, that keeps the offense just functional in general to have longer drives, to be more fantasy relevant for a Breece Hall and his production, floor ceiling combination. If it's not a receiving weapon at 10, well, it's got to be a tackle for Aaron Rodgers to protect him. But especially, look, if it's a Talise Fuanga out of Oregon State, an absolute mauler in the run game, man, that spells good for Breece Hall. I just keep falling back on how the Jets go at 10. Breece Hall is going to be a huge beneficiary in a Dynasty Fantasy Football sense. RB1 overall type, if it's not Christian McCaffrey, he seems right next in line there with as good as anybody. And it's not just looking like it's going to be for 2024 with Breece Hall. I'm not going to bet against the player. We're talking about a guy similar to Kyler Murray who recovered from a significant knee injury and made it look like nothing but a thing. So if you're a Breece Hall owner, you got to be feeling really, really good considering that you, similarly to Kyler Murray, have a guy that's mid, late second. Very well a year from now holds, if anything, I'm projecting becomes an early second round pick, top 15 type asset in Dynasty. Going back to the quarterback, well, we've got to start with the Titans at 7th overall. They've already addressed their offense in a way to support Will Levis in a Lloyd Cushenberry at center, a Calvin Ridley, already paving the way at least for Will Levis to be as well situated position to have a franchise defining, a career defining year. And in Dynasty, I know we don't like risk. I know we don't love it. But at the current price, barely a fringe, top 20 quarterback, you're talking about the upside to potentially, I'm not saying he's going to have it, not too dissimilar to Jalen Hurts and his true full first year starting, them surrounding him with weapons, giving him the ability to succeed. It's awfully reminiscent, awfully similar to me. And so you think about Joe Alt is the most often thought of player at that left tackle position to protect Will Levis's blind side. If it's not offensive tackle, you figure, look, there's situations, scenarios where I think the third receiver is potentially there on the board for the Titans. And so then you're talking about wide receiver 1 for effectively pairing them together and with Will Levis for possibly his entire career. What does it mean for the receivers in that room and their upside? That's one thing. But for the isolation of Will Levis and his value in Dynasty, he is going to be one of the biggest winners. Let's throw the Jalen Hurts comparison out the window. Another guy who, look where he stands even now, who I think Will Levis could have somewhat of a similar type trajectory, is what Jordan Love just did, where there's some ups and downs, some early splashes. You're talking about Will Levis, where he's currently valued in Dynasty. I'm not betting against the guy with the tools, the athleticism, the offense, the situation. Where do we find ourselves a year from now? Keep coming back to Will Levis being valued much more highly than he is currently. What could have went wrong effectively did go wrong for Bryce Young in his rookie year. You've got an interesting owner there with Dave Tepper, who's one of the more seemingly maniacal as one of the newer owners in the NFL, trying to make his team win football games, make his product at least a lot different than what it was. And so is he too reactionary? I don't think he's too reactive. I think it was somewhat proactive to completely clean house. Now you've got Dave Canales there. You've got new front office leadership as well. And you've got, by virtue of trading Brian Burns, whether that's the right move or not for the franchise, we can speculate in a whole different direction. But we're talking about fantasy football ultimately. And so with Bryce Young, with the Panthers having 2 top 40 picks, that is an opportunity to give Bryce another potential protective weapon in an offensive lineman, and then another actual fantasy, more relevant, more ostensibly clear asset, a potential Ricky Pearsall, and an Xavier Legette, and Xavier Worthy. Guys that are incredible talents for where they're going to be picked. Guys that would effectively have been in the conversation to be first-round picks in those early 20s for 2023's draft class. And I know we can play, you can say it's hindsight, but it really isn't. That's the talent, the nature of the talents in this receiver class and the depth to which it extends well beyond the first round. And so with Bryce Young valued a bit above Will Levis, obviously he's got that top of the first round edge compared to the top of the second round with Will Levis. But nonetheless, I see a meaningful rise for Bryce Young to the point where we're not talking about a 6th round startup pick. I think we're going to be talking about a 3rd round startup pick with Bryce Young. I'm not talking about Bryce Young being a top 10 quarterback or being what CJ Stroud was. I'm talking about meaningful progression to the point where in this dynasty, in this projection based game, there is going to be a totally new effective lease on life with how people view these players. And that's the theme. I'm not saying in a true 2024 1 year isolated fantasy sense. I'm trying to project further, project outward from where we stand now. And to do that, you've got to be a little bit brave, right? Or maybe you don't want to call it brave. You have to be somewhat forward looking. The production in years past doesn't carry over. We're talking about making bets, venturing off a ledge in some sense, taking on some risk, and potentially realizing some gain, some value that most people are sleeping on. Mock 10.0 coming out really shortly before, obviously, the draft kicks off on Thursday. We're going to be streaming live on night 2 of the NFL draft, guys, on Friday, and then day 3. That's where a lot of the bread's going to be buttered for us Dynasty owners. If you're feeling frisky, drop a like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments who you think are going to be the biggest winners of the 2024 NFL draft, kicking off very shortly, guys. Cannot wait. I will see you soon.